Give Emiko a big hand. Thank you, thank you. It's you know, every time I see it, I still feel the sick chills of seeing what was going on in the jail stockade. So, so what we're going to do is we'll have Jeff Ogata and Will Kaku, who both of them, their fathers were renunciants, and Will's dad ended up going to Bismarck. And I just wanted to mention, so a couple of announcements, I guess. We're having a Bismarck pilgrimage, an inaugural pilgrimage in September 5. We're going to be rolling out some publicity soon. And the Bismarck pilgrimage will honor the memory of the 1,200 Issei who were imprisoned there, and then the 750 renunciants from Tule Lake who were imprisoned there. And so that's September 5. I also wanted to just kind of give a shout out here to Conrad Adderer, whose film Resistance at Tule Lake. If you're curious about more about the renunciations, I think his film really opened the doors for a lot of people to understand what was happening in Tule Lake. And I think, I guess the other issue here to mention is what's going on right now at the National Park Service sites, right, with the QR codes for people to come and report information that they think is critical of U.S. history. So all of us are very deeply concerned about what's going on, what's going to happen at the social justice sites. So, so moving on to the next part of our program, I just wanted to introduce Jeff Ogata has been supporting the Asian community since the late 70s through picketing, protests, and advocacy in front of the City Council, the Board of Supervisors, and the California Legislature. He's also helped organizations provide direct legal services as a board director and doing training for volunteers. So I know him in Sacramento as one of the founders of Asian Legal Services, which was one of the early projects of law students offering legal services to community people. Now that he is a retired attorney, he has turned to screenwriting and acting. And so he is working on new career as an actor. And Will Kaku is the vice chair of the Nihonmachi Outreach Committee, and they host the San Jose Day of Remembrance programs. He's a docent there and a former board member of the Japanese American Memorial, or the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. And also he's a board member of the Tule Lake Committee and also a Tule Lake docent. A member of also the Japantown Lions. So, I guess, Will, do you want to come up first and you can tell us more about your own experience with your father?
Yeah, thank you very much, Barbara. You know, when you have a podium, you're expected to have a speech. I don't have one. So, I thought it would be very different. I don't have a speech, so I'm just going to ramble on. And let's see. I'm just going to ramble on, and hopefully it makes sense to you. I definitely don't have a conclusion. Again, I thought we were going to be seated here, and I was going to get asked questions. But anyways, and we'll keep track of time because I just may go over time too. So be aware of that. Oh, okay, we got a timekeeper. Okay, so anyways, this is a session on the descendants of the renunciants. So my father is a renunciant. His story is about descent and protest, and this sad story about renunciation. But also it's a story about how the community reacts to people, the dissenters like my father. And importantly as well, it's also how my father is, I would say, seriously injured by the response from the community. And he is embedded with a lifetime of shame. And that's really unfortunate. This is a story, my father's story, and the story of the dissenters is a story that we don't like to talk about. A lot of people don't like to talk about this story. It makes some people really uncomfortable. It makes some people very angry. It makes some people disgusted by what my father did. And it's also a story about shame. That's what I said. My father encountered a lifetime of shame. And as we know, and this hasn't been mentioned really too much in this sessions today, but we know what the dominant narrative is. The dominant narrative has been the story about the 442 and military service. And it's a tremendous story. It's a story about how Japanese Americans were rounded up, put behind barbed wire, not trusted as loyal Americans, yet many of them joined the military. They joined when we talk about the 442, one of the most highly decorated units in United States military history. It's an astounding story about people who paid the ultimate sacrifice with their lives while their families were behind barbed wire. That's a really compelling story. And it's such a powerful story, it even permeates within my family story. My mother is from Japan. She doesn't speak English very well. It's in broken English, but she will tell the story about the 442. And so, as I said, when they look at my father's story, that's the counter-narrative. It's not a complementary narrative to the 442. It's a counter-narrative. And when it's a counter-narrative, of course, people are going to say the people on one side were heroic, they were patriotic, they were really true Americans. And since it's a counter-narrative, they'll look at people like my father and call them unpatriotic, disloyal, and even cowards. That's what my father had to deal with. Now, my father was really reticent to speak about his experience. He didn't even like to talk about life in the camps. Yeah, he had a few stories about Hard Mountain, Wyoming, but zero stories about Tule Lake. He never talked about Tule Lake. And this is the one picture I have of Tule Lake. It's a picture of my grandfather's funeral. He was one of the 331 people who died at Tule Lake. And I would look at this picture, and I didn't know too much about the story about Tule Lake then. I would look at this picture, and I'd notice that, hey, my father's not in this picture, and neither are his older brothers. And I would ask my father, how come you're not in this picture? And often he would just shrug his shoulders. He was a man of a few words anyways, but he would just shrug his shoulders and he would walk away. Or sometimes he would just say, I don't know where I was. But then I told him one day I was going to the 2006 Tule Lake pilgrimage, and he was surprised by that. And then he finally let go of a secret that he held within himself for over 60 years. He said, I wasn't in this picture because I was a prisoner at Bismarck, North Dakota. And that shocked me. I didn't understand that. Bismarck, North Dakota, what's that place? And my mother said this in Japanese. She said, no, you were mistaken. You're wrong. You were in Tule Lake. You were in Tule Lake. And my father just stopped my mother and said, I haven't even told you this story. I was arrested as an enemy alien, and I was sent to Bismarck, North Dakota. I was a POW. And further said, I guess I didn't talk about this story because I was ashamed. Sorry. So he continued to talk about this story, and he talked about the experience of being deported to, rather sent to the Bismarck camp. And you saw those images in Miko's great film of people lining up, walking over to the train station or the train. And my father would talk about that. He actually said his father was walking with him to the train. Now, in your film, I saw all these guards, so I don't know how he walked with his father, but that's what he said, and maybe his memory failed him. But he said that he was walking with his father, and they just had no words exchanged between the two. My father had a difficult relationship with his own father, kind of similar to the relationship I had with my father. We really didn't talk about a whole lot of things. I think our longest conversation was probably two sentences strung together. But he would talk about this moment, walking to the train station with his father. And then he said, when they got to the train, he got on the train, and he said, he looked at his father, and he said, he was just staring at me. He was just staring at me intently, without any words, without any emotion. And he said, my father said, this was probably, we both knew this was probably the last time we would see each other again, because his father, he knew, had throat cancer, and he died several months later. So I should say also, he also revealed other stories too, which were amazing. The stories that he held to himself. He had also joined the Hoshidan. I don't think we saw any images of the Hoshidan there, perhaps, but some people would call the Hoshidan a pro-Japan faction in the camp. But I think that's probably mislabeled. People joined the Hoshidan for many different reasons. Some people, when you say pro-Japan, does that mean they want Japan to win the war? I don't think that was true with my father. It may have been true with his father, who my father did label him as really, really hardcore pro-Japan. So perhaps maybe he wanted Japan to win the war, but it was baffling to me. Why would my father join the Hoshidan? My father did not want to go to Japan. He stated that with his family. I do not want to go to Japan. He answered yes to 28. So he was not a true no-no. He answered yes to question 28. For people who don't know what that is, he swears allegiance to the United States and forswears any allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. He actually registered for selective service just months before he took that drastic step of renouncing his citizenship. My father was not enamored with Japanese culture. In fact, sometimes I felt that he tried to steer himself away from Japanese culture. He couldn't speak Japanese well, very poorly. My mom said that he didn't learn to speak Japanese until he went to Japan after the war. So why did he take that very fateful step of joining the Hoshidan and then renouncing his citizenship? 2 minutes. So perhaps it was a situation of being in that really poisonous, toxic atmosphere of Tule Lake. There were really harsh conditions in that camp. People were beaten. One person was hit with a baseball bat so hard the bat broke in two. People were rounded up, thrown into the jail in the stockade without any charges. without any legal representation. It was a really harsh camp to live in. And his own brother was actually arrested too, for being for not reporting to his draft induction. He was one of the Tule Lake draft resistors. So perhaps my father saw in the Hoshidan a group of people who gave you a little bit of pride in your own heritage when he's coming from a situation where his race, his ethnicity is denigrated. Maybe it's a sense that, as I said, gave him pride. And I kind of compare that situation to the 1960s, where we talk about the Black pride and Black power movements. That community saw police brutality, abuse, disenfranchisement. They saw inequity in society. They saw a draft where the Black men were drafted disproportionately into Vietnam when other people in other communities could take advantage of college deferment. So I could totally understand from that perspective why some of those people were looking at other organizations like the Nation of Islam or the Black Panthers in organizations that built up self-esteem within yourself, agency and self-determination. I could totally see that. And so perhaps that's the appropriate analogy to look at how we view the Hoshidan. Now, do I have a little bit of time left? I don't know. Okay, we're almost there. Let's see. So there's more to my father's story, obviously. I'm trying to think of a conclusion, but I will say this. What this story means, it really fractures the community. People did not like what my father did. My mother, at one point, doing a New Year's celebration at her house, invited one of my father's best friends to celebrate New Year's with us. Now, my father couldn't speak because he was incapacitated. He had suffered a major stroke, so he couldn't talk. But his good friend said this. He said, he sat at our table and he says, I will never forgive those no-nos and those protesters for what they did. And it occurred to me, well, does that mean my father didn't even tell him? I find that hard to believe, but possibly that's true. And I spoke up and I said, oh, you didn't know my father was one of these guys? And he was kind of surprised, and he just said, oh, I meant everybody except for your father. So that's how some people, he said my father was too young to know what he was doing. So that's how the community, some members of the community reacted. And I can't blame him for going against my father, because if you're a military war veteran and you see your buddies get killed in action, how can you make that emotional leap to forgive somebody who didn't go? That takes a real change in your heart. But I also see it from my father's side, standing up for your rights, trying to uphold the very values and beliefs and laws under the Constitution of the United States. So I see it from both sides. And we have to remember, this is not an 80-year-old story, as I said before. This affects us today. And I think about the quote from Judge Marilyn Patel, who during the Coram Novus trial of Korematsu said this. I may get this wrong, but it's something like this. It says, during times of distress, we must not use the shield of military necessity and national security to protect government actions from close scrutiny and accountability. It stands as a warning that through international hostilities and antagonisms, our institutions, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches must exercise their authority to protect all citizens from petty fears and prejudices that are easily aroused. And I would say to that, more than just citizens, all people under the jurisdiction of the United States. I know I need the stop sign, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Will, for your passion and also for your willingness to be a story carrier, because without the children of people who were treated in such a brutal and humiliating way, and people who stood up, without your voices, we will lose these stories. So looking, where's Jeff? Oh, here you are. So Jeff, I interviewed Jeff's dad about 20 years ago, and unfortunately, we should have been interviewing a lot of these folks 25, 30 years earlier. So, and his dad was one of the very rare people who was proud of what he did. So here's Jeff Ogata.
I wrote some stuff out, but given everything that happened this morning and what I'm seeing again, I decided I need to rewrite this. So I'm just going to use this as notes and just kind of probably play it by ear a little bit. And also, it's dark up here, so I can't see these notes anyway. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to take off my glasses to read my notes. Okay. So I'm a Sansei. I was born in Pasadena. One little side note is that I went to school in Pasadena, John Muir High School, that in 1972, we had the largest number of Japanese Americans graduating from high school that year. Usually, if you know LA, Gardena High School always had the most. But the Raffo Shippo published the names of everybody every year, all the JAs that graduated, and I took the time to count the names of every person that graduated, and my school beat Gardena High. Now, I say that because hopefully it'll tie up later on when I get to the end about that experience, because, we had a lot of Japanese Americans around, and yet we never talked about it growing up either. So it was kind of an odd thing, and again, I'll maybe get to that in a minute if I remember. So my father, Morito Ogata, was born in 1923, and he was born here. At the age of 3, his parents took him back to Japan along with his younger sisters as well, I think. But anyway, he spent 13 years in Japan, and he returned 16, and that was like 1939. His father sent him back to the United States to avoid being drafted by the Japanese army, because right at that time the Japanese were doing their thing, and so his father said he didn't want his son being in the Japanese military, so he sent him back here. My father was very happy to come back here, but he didn't know where to go. So it turns out that his oldest sister was living in Marysville, California, north, and so he went to stay with her. He never really liked his oldest sister, and he couldn't stand living with her for too long. So he decided to go out on his own. So he took his little blanket, and he became a migrant farm worker. So he picked grapes, tomatoes, grapes in Ocampo, tomatoes in Sacramento, peaches in Marysville, and he just did this itinerant route, that a lot of people did. So that's what he did until his second sister, who was his favorite sister, got married and lived in Culver City down, LA, West LA. And she said, "Why don't you come down and stay with me?" So he went down there, but he decided that he got a better offer to stay in a boarding house in Pasadena. So he went to a boarding house and he became a houseboy, right? Back in the day, some of the white families would hire young people to help them with their house chores or whatever, and they'd go to school, and he'd get paid a little bit of money to do that. So that's what he did. So then the war breaks out. Well, so one other thing is, these people were very nice to him. When after Pearl Harbor, he said the FBI notified this family that they were going to come and ask my dad questions, right? A 17, 18-year-old kid, they're going to ask him some questions. Well, he had pictures of airplanes and boats on his wall. And the family said, "You need to take all that down." Because they knew what would happen if, the FBI came and saw that he had all these pictures, because he's a spy, right? So they made him take it all down. And so then at that point, he decided that, okay, well, maybe hearing about what was going to happen, they were going to be evacuated, he decided that he better stay with his sister. So he got permission from the military, because at that point, if you were going to go more than 5 or 10 miles away from where you lived, you had to get permission. He got permission to leave Pasadena, go to Culver City. So he stayed with his sister and his brother-in-law and their family, and from there they went to Manzanar. So of course, Manzanar, the story about the loyalty oath, he decides he's going to be a no-no. Now, again, he was 18, so in my mind, it's like, well, did he really know what he was doing? Did somebody talk to him? Was he getting pressure? What was that sort of about? And I have to say, though, in all the years that we talked about it, his story was always consistent. So I'm pretty sure that, what he was telling me was right. What he said was that to the first question about joining the military, he said to them, well, you got us locked up in camp. You got my family locked up. We can't go anywhere. And if I join the military, are you going to have me shoot my parents when I go to Japan? I'm not going to go to Japan and shoot my relatives there. So no, I'm not going to join the military. And in respect to the second question, he said, well, yeah, I was in Japan for a while, but I wanted to come back to the United States. I'm a citizen. I don't have any loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. So I really can't answer that question yes either. So that's how he became a Nono boy. So one of the things about my dad was that it turns out that, a lot of people my age never heard about the camps, right? Because as we know, Issei's didn't want to talk about it. They kept it very quiet. But my father was a little different because one of the reasons is in our den, he had a picture of the Manzanar barracks, and it was like this long, this tall, and it was up above the fireplace, right? I grew up with that. And so we'd say, oh, camp, was that like summer camp? You have a good time? He goes, yeah, something like that. So of course, over time, I learned more about what Manzanar really was. So he wasn't unwilling to talk to me about it at all. I asked him questions, he'd give me answers. Now, I didn't hear that much about Tule Lake, but he told me about Manzanar. So, when I talked to my friends, like I said, so I graduated in a high school class with a large number of Japanese Americans. So we started talking to my friends like, so, what did your dad do about camp? They're like, what? I go, what do you mean, what? He goes, didn't you hear about this? He goes, well, a little bit, but, no, they don't talk about it. So then I'm realizing that, well, my father's a little different here because he's actually willing to talk to me about what happened to him. I mean, he didn't go out of his way, but when I asked him questions, he answered the best he could. So I said, well, how was it? And he said, well, I was 18, 19 years old. My parents were in Hiroshima, so he didn't have any supervision. His older sister was someplace else. His younger sister was still in Manzanar. So he said, I had a pretty good time. I learned how to cook fried potatoes. His claim to fame, whenever he made something, he said, well, I can make fried potatoes. Yeah, okay, great, Dad. That's all he ever cooked. My mom did all the cooking. But he was proud of his fried potatoes that he learned how to cook in camp. And he said, yeah, we, played some baseball, went to dances. I got to chase the girls. I had basically a good time, except for the fact that we were in prison. We didn't get to go anywhere. So he was angry about that, but I don't think he was really bitter about it, but he was angry. So whenever we'd go through this conversation, he would always end up with, and that's why you need to treat people fairly, equally, and respectfully. So I grew up with that. So then when he talks about what happened at Tule Lake, at some point then he says, I threw my citizenship away. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, I sent my birth certificate to Washington, D.C., and so I wasn't a citizen. And I said, oh, is that how you renounce? I never heard of that. He said, well, that's all I remember doing, but, I found out that I wasn't a citizen anymore, and so I had to join this lawsuit, this guy, and he got citizenship back for 5,000 of us, right? Which later on I learned is Wayne Collins, right? Who spent 20 years doing this work. And I actually do have a little alien card that my dad got that he's got his alien number on it and everything, even though he was a citizen already. And his biggest regret about that renouncing was that he thought that would prevent me from getting a government job. He said, yeah, since I renounced and I was a bad boy, you probably aren't going to get a government job ever. And I thought, oh, okay, well, that's interesting to know. So thanks for that information. I did get a government job, so probably that wasn't a big deal. But it was interesting because when I saw the order that, and thanks to Sharon Yamato for helping me through that process, saw the order, it was signed in 1956, which is like 2 years after I was born, right? And the order does say something like, let's see. The order declares the purported applications for renunciation are declared to be, and at all times to have been, null, void, and without legal effect. So presumably, legal language didn't matter, right? That was all wiped away. So again, he was open with me about what happened. And so thinking about, why was it that he was comfortable when everybody else didn't want to talk about it? They all felt ashamed. They were all really quiet about it. It seems to me, and I wish I would have done this, of course, 20, 30 years ago, my dad had a support group. He had a bunch of friends, male friends that always hung out together. We went to the beach every other weekend in summer and camped out at the beach. We went to parties all the time with them. We went to Kenjinkai things, family associations. We did all kinds of stuff with these guys. And now I'm wondering, I think these guys were probably also no-nos and renunciants, right? So he had his own little support group where he didn't have to go and feel bad about what he did because they all did it together. And so I think that's true. I've been trying to track down the sons of my friends who I grew up with. I can't find them, I can't ask them questions. But stuff like that is interesting in terms of the research that we're doing. Now, we did have some interesting episodes. So we used to go to Little Tokyo, in LA quite often. And from time to time, we'd run into people, and he said, and apparently he knew them from camp. He said, oh, yeah, I remember them from camp, and they were very friendly. They talked to each other, and then we'd go on. But one time, there were a couple of guys that walked up to him, and again, I have no idea how they knew him or if he was a known or whatever. I don't have any idea how they knew him. But they kind of got into it a little bit. They started yelling at him, and one man actually spit on my dad. And I thought, I've never seen that before. That's an interesting aspect of camp, I guess, because that's never happened before. So I tried to ask him about that. And at that point, he just said, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. These guys are just, they're just mad. Don't worry about it. So that stuck with me for quite a while. And that got me thinking about, okay, so camp wasn't just about peeling potatoes, going to dances, having a good time. So again, it was something that has sort of followed me around, but I always thought, okay, so I knew enough about camp that I wasn't necessarily that interested in pursuing more because I knew a lot more than my friends knew. But then, I hear this thing about Wayne Collins, and so I got his application, his affidavit, and 80% of what he told me was kind of in this thing, but 20% isn't. And of course, the rule, 20% is the hardest part of anything, right? 80% is E, 20%. And so this thing about how he was in the Hoshidan for a couple of weeks, but then he quit because he thought they were stupid marching around. But his brother-in-law pressured him into saying, well, you better renounce because, these guys are going to come back and they're going to beat you up. Stuff like that. And it was like, that's just so interesting to me because that story never came out. That part of it I never heard. And then even more kind of ridiculous, when I think about it, is that his brother-in-law, his favorite sister's family, they were in Manzanar. I always thought they were in Manzanar the whole time. No, it turns out they ended up in Tule Lake as well. I never knew that. What I really didn't know is they took voluntary deportation to Japan. And I never knew that until like literally 3 months ago, all this time later. And so I asked my cousin, I said, you guys, I remember my cousin coming back from Japan to babysit us when she was 17. I just thought that they were, having a trip to Japan. She'd been there a little bit because my dad was Kibe, right? So he was born here, educated in Japan. So I thought maybe that's what they were doing too, getting some education in Japan. And no, that wasn't it. That was actually the first time they had come back from Japan. And so I asked my cousin about it, who was only 4 or 5 years old. She remembers nothing. And I said, well, did your mom ever say anything to you about Japan? And she said, no, she wouldn't talk about it. She said it was a horrible experience. They went to Hiroshima. They lived on a farm outside. And her grandmother said, we wish you weren't here because we don't have enough food for ourselves, let alone for all of you. So it must have been a really, really horrible experience for them. So, and again, I wish I had talked to all my uncles about it because this family takes voluntary deportation, but the 3 younger brothers all stayed here. So again, everybody had their own little personal stories and personal reasons why they did what they did. And so it's always fascinating to me to hear about it. Now, so going back to school. So it turns out that the father of one of my high school classmates, his name was Yoshihito Kuromiya, and he's got a story. He's got a book, Beyond the Betrayal, Memoirs of World War II, J, Draft Resistor of Conscience. He was a Nisei member of the Fair Play Committee at Hart Mountain. So he's got a book out. It's been about like 2 years, but it's starting to make its rounds. Again, okay, so this is a woman I went to high school with, and up until like 2 months ago, I didn't know her father was a draft resistor. So now I'm thinking, is there a way for me to contact all of my classmates and ask them what their stories are? That would be fascinating, right? To find out who went to the military, who was a draft resistor, who was a no-no. Because I'm sure with 170 of us that graduated thereabouts that year, there's got to be a lot of wonderful stories in there, right? I don't know what I would do with them, but it would be interesting to find out. So my takeaway is that, and I think the panel sort of agrees with this, is that there's no really right or wrong. We all very appreciative of the 442 and the military and the vets and what they did. It was amazing, proud to be, aware of them and proud of the heritage. Well, I'm equally proud of the fact that there were people that stood up and in their own way not in their own way, are patriotic, loyal, law-abiding, and they're standing up to government to make sure that the Constitution is being fulfilled, right? So as a young lawyer, I did work for Legal Services of Northern California, which is, providing legal services to poor people. And at the time, President Reagan came in and tried to do away with funding for the entire Legal Services Corporation nationwide. And so I got to speak to a lot of the Republicans who wanted to come around and see, are you guys doing valuable work? What the hell are you doing? Because we're going to get rid of you. And I used to tell them, well, I hate to tell you, sir, but I feel like I'm more conservative than you are because I am trying to uphold the Constitution. I'm trying to make sure that due process is available to everybody. What's more conservative than that? There's nothing radical about that. There's nothing left about that, right? That's the most basic conservative thing you can do in this country is to stand up for the Constitution. And I still feel that way today. So I don't think anybody was wrong. I think everybody was right in terms of the personal choices they made. And I think that still carries over to today, right? We should be proud of the fact that people are rallying and protesting because we are not radicals. We're more right-wing than the right wing. We're upholding the Constitution, for goodness sakes, right? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. It's so important for us to encourage, I think, the descendant voices of people who were in Tule Lake, and especially the people who were the no-nos and renunciants. And I just wanted to mention that to give a shout out to Andrew Leong back there, who has copies of Tesaku, which is a Japanese language literary journal that was published in Tule Lake. And that to remind people that a lot of the voices, the hearts and minds of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated is captured in Japanese. It was a language that was, it was hidden from the man. And that we're realizing now that many of the more candid expressions of people's thoughts and feelings were in Japanese. So it's really fantastic that Andrew and other folks have been doing these translations of Japanese language materials. And again, if these are the things that you're finding in your relatives' homes, he's somebody to consult to see what they might be before you decide to throw them away. Since so many Japanese Americans have been victims of cultural genocide, and we don't know the language, and so it's sort of closed away. But it's one very valuable, important source of what people were thinking about and doing. So we have, I guess, about 10, 15 minutes we could take questions, Chizu? Is that? Yeah, and so, we could take questions for Emiko, or Will, or Jeff, or myself. So, I mean, the renunciation period was incredibly, it's still, there's a lot of research that needs to be done. And I think it's one of the most important parts of the story of the wartime incarceration, because it was the people who were in Tule Lake, and especially the renunciants, were really brutalized. And it's a story that has been hidden away. I mean, when I called Jeff's dad, it was what a relief that he said yes, that he would like to do an interview, because out of maybe I got about 24, my colleague and I, Judy Tachibana, we got about 24 people who agreed to do interviews. But for every interview we probably got 10 hang-ups, or people saying, don't talk to me, where'd you get my name? One man really broke down in tears and begged me not to tell anybody that he was a renunciant. There was so much stigma within our community about the renunciations that is a big part of why the story has really not emerged very clearly. And like I said before, I felt I started way too late. Most of the renunciants were gone. And it's been tragic, I think, because there hasn't been a community of memory for renunciants to gather and to feel safe enough to tell their stories. I mean, we had handfuls of people participating in Tule Lake pilgrimages, and I think they were just really deeply powerful and meaningful gatherings. But it was a short period of time. So, any thoughts or questions?
Well, first of all, I want to pay my respects to you, Barbara.
Well, thank you.
Well, this community owes you a great debt for championing people whose lives were attacked and in some cases destroyed by the internalized racism that took place in our community. And you have spoken fearlessly, tirelessly, and passionately on behalf of people's lives and their civil liberties. And I think you have been the champion for narrative change here. And I think that's what this whole conference is about, is trying to tell the truth. Can we tell the truth finally? So thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mike. I am truly humbled. It's just, when you're in the moment, you basically, you put one foot in front of the other and you just do the work. You see the work that needs to be done and you do it. And I feel very fortunate to have been an advocate for voices that have been silenced. And because I feel so strongly that the people at Tule Lake were really our community's heroes. My dad was also a vet. He was one of those vets who he was drafted before the war. And his unit ended up taking away, his rifle, stripping him and sending him to a prisoner of war camp down in Griffith Park. And then parked him over at Fort Bliss. There was another Army internment camp there, and then eventually put him in the 442 and the 522nd. So, here he is liberating Dachau while my mother is in a concentration camp. So, a lot of ironies, but thank you so much, Mike, for your work. I think what has been so wonderful with Suru for Solidarity that really emerged out of the Tule Lake pilgrimage. I think the Suru for Solidarity is doing really wonderful work that is meeting the moment. And I just congratulate you and honor you for your work. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I do have a question. Oh. Maybe it's a comment, but my quick question, it was to both you and Emiko, which was when I saw the film, I was fortunate to see an earlier version as well. It just struck me about the dehumanization of these Japanese men, right? And I had never seen it portrayed that way. So honestly, again, it's about the truth. Just wondered if you had a comment about your research process in making that film, because there's something about, I think, like I think of, the phrase that came to my mind when I watched it was, I am a man. I am a man. And I didn't understand as a Yonsei why I carried all these sort of masculinity image struggles. But then I understood something very clearly. I just wondered if you had comments about that, because you worked with those images and also understood the story before we saw this today. Just wondered if you had some comments. Thank you.
Well, I think the one who should answer that is Emiko, because it was her brilliant idea to use the images and also the interpretation. All of us have seen those photos or samples of those photos of people being dragged around, right, or people in the jail, but to see all of the photos in sequence and to have the interpretation, it gives it more meaning and depth to have that broader context. So here, Emiko.
Well,
Yeah, and feel free to ask her questions about the film process.
Barbara sent me these, as did Hiroshi Shimizu, some time ago. And Barbara's been asking me to make a movie of the jail for about 2 or 3 years. And I finally, the photos are quite striking. I'm sorry that this particular projection was overexposed, so you couldn't sort of see, because they were quite well photographed by this man. And Barbara, come here because we have to talk about him. But anyway, and then I started to read the captions, and I said, well, here it all is. I mean, we don't have to say anything, just read the captions. Okay, I will say I did edit the captions, and there were many pictures of the Hoshidan and things like that, which I thought we could not kind of get into that in this little movie. We were just making a short movie. So, and because the story of people, as Will says, about people who joined, even people who renounced, is very complicated. There are many elements going on, not the least of which people had already been in prison for at least probably 2 years. And you're being asked all these things and all these questions and all that. So people made decisions based on just their circumstances. And so the photographs, of course, were perfect for the government to say, see, here they are. They're all marching around. They are Japanese loyalists. So we were right to put them in jail. So in this way, they constructed the reasons for us to be in there. First of all, they created the situation. Then then now people were trying to prepare to go back to Japan, so they had these classes and so it was kind of a double thing. Now they could actually use those photographs against us again. But I just Barbara knows a little bit more about the photographer, because there's an interesting story there. And I have one little anecdote about the Green Hornet. Before the war, I think it was before the war, or certainly before we went to camp, of course, there was a radio show. The Green Hornet was a radio show. And he had a Japanese sidekick named Kato. Well, of course, his ethnicity changed. He became Filipino, and then he was something else, and then he just became the sidekick. Well, the man who voiced Kato in the early radio shows was in Manzanar. And the reason we wanted to use that particular cover, because there's a lot of stuff out there about, the racist things that we saw, there's lots of things like that. This was specific to Tule Lake, it had a sign there. And so that's the reason we wanted to use it. And then we found out that the man, because then Barbara looked up his name, and sure enough, there he is in Tule Lake. But tell him about the photographer and his son.
Okay.
Right.
Sure. So all of those amazing photographs of the jail and the stockade were taken by a WRA reports officer named Robert Ross. And Robert Ross was raised in Japan. He was the child of missionaries and learned to speak and read Japanese. So a lot of those copies of Tesaku were translated. I saw them at the archives. I saw the translations of Tesaku, and they were pretty the literature that was translated, it seemed like pretty terrible stuff. But it wasn't until I read Junko Kobayashi's dissertation, which I'm blanking on the name. Somebody help me. Bittersweet Home, right? And she had done a dissertation on Japanese language literature in Japan, and that's when I realized that the translations that were done by Ross were probably fairly clumsy translations. So it's fantastic that we have somebody like Andrew, who is literate in Japanese and also able to do the pre-Meiji Japanese to tell us a little bit more about what's going on. So. Oh, and then John. Robert Ross's had a son who was born in Tule Lake, and it's so interesting. He ended up marrying a woman who was also born in Tule Lake. They had met maybe 25 years later and found out this connection they had, both being born in Tule Lake. So, yeah, but we're so fortunate to have the photos that I think so clearly express the kind of brutality and the efforts to humiliate people and demonize them. And so we're just so grateful. I see Hanako there.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Barbara, Emiko, Jeff, and Will for this great presentation.